Kristine Weber. Um, I've been teaching about trauma in this month in the Subtle Yoga Resilience Society. I should say about trauma recovery and yoga for trauma recovery. And I've been teaching mental health professionals about using yoga for trauma recovery for, gosh, it's 12 years now at the Mountain Area Health Education Center. So I've had a lot of experience working with folks with trauma. I worked in an intensive outpatient partial hospitalization program for folks in recovery for a couple of years, and then I've seen lots of private clients over the years. And I also worked in a nursing home hospice facility where there was a lot of trauma as well. So I've had a lot of experience working in the institutions and seeing the way trauma manifests, and it's such a fascinating course of study because all of us have trauma. And also that was my interest in studying trauma too. It's what about my own trauma and how can I help it with yoga? So yoga is such a great complementary or adjunctive practice to bring into whatever kind of licensed care folks are getting for trauma. So I always want to make sure I emphasize that. I think we have to be really careful in the yoga world. And maybe we haven't always been, but I think we have to be really careful that we are not promoting yoga as a therapy, because when you're working with folks with things like trauma, you're also working with things like depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and that really is serious, and so it deserves serious treatment, right? It deserves licensed professional treatment, people who are trained to work in this. And that being said, that doesn't mean that yoga can't be helpful. Yoga can be very helpful. And I have definitely worked with people who said yoga helped me more than XYZ therapy. I've worked with people like that, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that gives me license to go, oh yeah, okay, so yoga is going to fix you and don't do anything else. And that happens in the yoga world sometimes. So I always like to have those little caveats, be careful with the way you're saying this. Use words like adjunctive, complementary, supportive, but not treatment. Even if you're a yoga therapist, you have to be very careful. And working as a yoga therapist, when I was working side by side with licensed clinical social workers, licensed professional counselors, psychologists, then I had it's so great. That's the way yoga works really well, is in a team setting. So anyway, those are just some of my thoughts about working with folks with trauma. Now let's get to the topic at hand, which is, we all know that the breath regulates the nervous system. There's tons of data on that. When we have access to the breath, we can not only change the state of our emotional lives, but we can also eventually, over time, change the traits of who we are. So it's very powerful stuff. And one of the things I noticed even before I started studying trauma was that many people have trouble with breathing practices. They can't feel where the breath moves in their body. They don't like it. You tell them to breathe slow, it makes them breathe faster. And what this is about, so here's what it's about. When there has been a trauma, say, for example, somebody almost drowned, or say, for example, somebody was choked, or say, for example, they had to hold their breath and be quiet so the perpetrator would not notice them, all those sorts of things, right? What has happened in the nervous system is that you've created a pattern of breathing. Oh, and by the way, this can happen with disease processes too, like asthma. So it's not necessarily, although there are links between asthma and trauma, but anyway, it's not necessarily only from this emotional trauma or psychological trauma. So what happens is the nervous system creates a pattern of breathing that supports survival, right? Because that is the biological imperative of all human beings. That is the foundational thing of all human beings, survival. How can I survive, right? That's just what we're driven to do. So you've got this biological imperative, and you have figured out how to do it with your breath. And trauma is all about all about the body staying in that state to maintain survival. So even though the trauma has passed and it's 10 years or 20 or 40 years later, the body has created a pattern of survival that includes holding the breath or not wanting to mess with breath. And then you come along and you're the yoga teacher and you're like, okay, we can do these cool breathing exercises. It's gonna make you feel great. And the person's like, oh, because you just messed around with their survival instinct. So that's the thing to keep in mind, that breath, when you're teaching somebody breathing practices, you may be messing around with a implicit, which means under the level of consciousness, an implicit pattern that their body has adopted to maintain survival, to stay alive. You're messing with the survival response. Can you see why breathing practices can trigger people? Before I understood that, I'd be like, oh my God, why can't you figure out this? I was a little judgy about it because I'd be like, it's so simple, but it's not simple for folks who, so I always talk about my trauma lenses. Like when you put your trauma glasses on, you can see things really differently and you develop compassion for yourself and others, right? Because my judgy little judginess is about my own lack of self-compassion too, right? So when I started to develop, put those trauma lenses on, and then I could be like, oh, not everybody can breathe. Not everybody can do intricate, ratios or nadi shodhana or sitali or any of those practices that we consider just sort of normal yoga breathing practices. Not everybody can access them. Okay, which then raises the question, so what can people do? Right. And if we know that breath is the way to get into the autonomic nervous system, how can we help folks? This was such a puzzling question to me, and I figured out some things on my own over time. And I also spent some time talking to my teacher, Gary Kraftso, about it. And he has some brilliant insights into this as well. He's such a good pranayama teacher. At any rate, that's where I came to this place of like, oh, there are so many things we can do. So let's look at what we can do instead of what we can't do. That's always a good strategy in life for trauma, but then for life in general too. It's always a good strategy. Okay, so what are some things you can do? Well, you can try different things. You can introduce different things and see what people like. And this is for you as well as if you're a teacher, it's for your students. Like you can play with it. And when you adopt an attitude of play, that activates the play circuit, which is a little bit of a combination of sympathetic and ventral vagal. And that's a great circuit to be in because it really starts to test your window of tolerance and, it starts to push your nervous system a little bit in a healthy way. Play is so important. And the other big piece here is why is play important? Because of agency. When you're playing and you have a sense of control over your body, you have a sense of agency. Control is everything. When people have a sense of control, they can have a sense of and they can do anything, right? Because they have a feeling of agency. So agency changes the experiments, for example, that they do on animals. When the animals have agency, their stress hormones go down. It's fascinating stuff. I don't have time to get into that right now, but maybe another time. Okay, so let's get to it. So what could you do? Okay, so one thing you could do is let's play with moving our breath through our hands, like like let's play with what happens if we make these this kind of sounds. You could play with sighing in the same way. And just using your arms. So making sounds is one way that you can sneak in breath practices without doing formal breathing practices. Some people don't like making sounds, and I get that, right? This morning I was teaching stuff where we were like grunting like gorillas, and for some people that feels like fun, and other people it's just like, I don't want to grunt like a gorilla. So there's always you always have to give an option. Like, here's one idea, here's one possibility. You don't like it, let's try something else, right? So now the other possibility, of course, because you know this from your yoga practice, is chanting, right? So what about let's do an Om together. Om, and we'll just have a short Om, and we'll do that a couple times. Hey, what if we make our Om a little bit longer? Om, What if we make our ohm a little higher? Oh, right. So you have all these options. And working with sound is so good because the breath comes out with the sound. And when we lengthen the exhale, we start to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. You're taking your foot off of the vagal brake. And that's, again, too much to go into right now, but that's a good thing. So we kind of lengthen this, kind of lengthening this. It just occurred to me, foot off the vagal brake or foot on, if I got that wrong. On the vagal brake. Yeah, you put your foot on the vagal brake when you exhale, sorry, and you take it off when you inhale. I just want to make sure I got that right. Okay, so so then you make a sound and it's like vagal brake, oh, because you're lengthening the exhale. So that's why the sounds are good. Om is a really simple way to do it, but you can use any chant you want, or a song. That's another option. So play, think about things like, or sounds, and using your hands, and then chanting, and using that to lengthen your exhale. And I hope this gives you some ideas of things you can do with folks who aren't interested in breathing practices, but maybe up for a little play and a little fun, with their yoga practice. So everybody's individual. Everybody has different ways that they respond to these practices. What you want is lots of options, because that makes you have more facility, have more, capacity as a yoga person, as a yoga professional. And it makes your clients feel, your students feel like they have lots of options, and then they have more agency because they have more sense of control over what they're doing. Okay, I hope this was fun and helpful. Please leave a comment. It's really nice to have you here, and I'll see you next week. Bye.